Corporations are a big part of the problem when it comes to climate-harming emissions. Multinational companies account for nearly a fifth of global emissions. But corporations are also leading the way in transitioning to a low-carbon world. Their innovation and entrepreneurship are needed to help roll out climate solutions at scale. And they can pivot and adapt much more quickly than governments. In this session, our panellists will respond to the question, what does corporate climate leadership look like?
Perfect. So thanks so much, Orlagh, for the introduction, and thank you to the organisers for organising such a fantastic conference and asking me to speak. It's so great to be here today. I've met so many people already that I haven't seen in ages, and I'm looking forward to meeting everyone else who I haven't got a chance to talk to yet. Corporate climate leadership. So I basically want to talk about one idea which I think is the most important thing for me when it comes to corporate climate leadership, and that's corporate performance on climate. So as Orlagh said, accounting is my field, so I'm going to start with a bit of an accounting angle on this. I want to talk about where we are now with corporate performance, where we need to be, and how do we get there. So when it comes to measuring performance, this is what accounting is all about. So if you think of something like a budget is the classic tool. So with a budget, whether it's your own budget or a much more complex budget in a corporation, you're setting targets, you're monitoring your performance, you're assessing your performance, and then you're addressing the variances. And we have seen in the last particularly in the last kind of 10 years or so, companies starting to do this with greenhouse gas emissions as well. So as well as counting money, they're also counting carbon. So they've been starting to set targets, starting to monitor performance. The issue with this has been that performance to date has been inadequate. So if you take what really matters, say for sake of argument, say there's one key performance indicator that matters on a global level, and that's global greenhouse gas emissions. And if you look at the industrial processes, energy consumption sector, the forecasts are saying that those emissions have hit their highest level ever in 2021. So companies have been engaging, the sector has been engaging with climate action for 20, 30 years now. So this level of performance is unacceptable at this stage. So we have more action, we have targets, we don't have results yet. And what we need are results. So that's where we are now. The second thing I want to talk about is where we need to be. And this is easier. We know that we need to stay under 1.5. 1.5 is where we need to be. And, for that, we need to set targets. We need to have visions and plans. And this is something that the corporate sector has been very good at presenting visions, setting targets. But target setting is not leadership. Achieving targets, results, performance, that's what leadership is. And setting a target doesn't mean that it's going to be met. So what we see, I do a lot of work in sustainability reporting research, disclosure of environmental and social impacts, including climate impacts. And what we see time and time again is that when a company fails to meet a target, two things will generally happen. So first of all, the reporting of, the measures reported, the consistency, it will become more opaque. It's harder to find the information as the company's sort of action goes on. And they will also set a bigger, shinier target to distract from not meeting the targets. And you see this even in kind of the early movers on sustainability, your Unilevers, your Marks and Spencers, your Board Bia in Ireland, that they will do a lot of measuring of performance initially, but then when the answer that they're getting is the wrong answer, it becomes less palatable and you're less likely to want to disclose and report that. So target setting can be very useful, but it's nothing without measurement and performance. So I told you I would talk about where we need to go and how we can fix this. So I have two proposals, basically two words, which I'm going to say a few extra words on then. The two words are connection and transparency. So the first thing we need for corporate climate leadership is connection. So throughout this presentation, well, I've been talking so far, I haven't really mentioned, specific companies that are good or bad or, good or bad performers on climate. That's because it is so difficult to measure this and account for this at the individual single entity level. So if you take scope 3 emissions, which is kind of the emissions to do with, say, a company's procurement or its business travel, there are so many different methodologies for measuring scope 3, for setting those boundaries. It's so difficult to tell who is responsible for these emissions in a supply chain, for example. And there was a study last year in Nature which looked at tech companies, and they found that over half of scope 3 emissions are not being accounted for. So no one's taking responsibility. Who do these emissions belong to? So to look at the scope 3 emissions, we need to be thinking in terms of sectors as opposed to in terms of individual entities. So we need companies and sectors working together to calculate sectoral emissions and link this to the existing national and global reporting, some of which is on a sectoral basis. So that's connection. The second thing I want to talk about is transparency, transparent reporting. And this is an issue for organisations internally and externally. So internally, organisations need to recognise and resource this in the way that they resource their financial accounting, management accounting and reporting processes, which isn't the case at the moment. And if you talk to sustainability professionals, they'll hear that. So, resource this, assign responsibility, have cost centres, assign accountability for who in the organisation is in charge of emissions. Measure this and then report it. And don't just report your successes, report failure. Companies are scared to report failure, but when it comes to financial reporting, if you make a loss, you have to report it. It's there in black and white, it's transparent. I want to see environmental climate reports from companies that are as transparent and as boring, if you like, as financial reporting. I want to see it there. Show me the numbers. Show me your emissions in black and white, year on year, whether they are going up and down. So embrace failure. And the regulation is going to drive this as well. But, in that companies will have to report no matter what the emissions are. But also it needs to be driven by companies as well. Finally, quick word on climate leadership. So obviously I was thinking about it for this panel. What does leadership look like? Who are the leaders? I think leadership requires an acknowledgement of responsibility. You often find that corporations will be they'll be quick to sort of assign responsibility onto the people who buy their products, but they will also, responsibility for reducing emissions onto the consumers of products. But they will also, in the background, be lobbying to against legislation that would support corporate climate leadership. And we've seen this in the EU recently introduced their draft Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive or Corporate Due Diligence Directive. It started as a corporate governance initiative, and the idea was that directors' remuneration would be linked to sustainability performance and climate performance, and now that's been watered down thanks to industry lobbying, is the argument. So there needs to be, from business, an acknowledgement that this economic system is not providing climate action, it's not providing social justice, and businesses are some of them are hugely powerful financial and socio-political actors within this. And people really need to think, as a business, what can I do to make this system better and change it? Thank you.
Hi everyone, it's great to be here with you, and I suppose I'm going to try and give the perspective of the state of corporate sustainability as it is today, and echoing a lot of what Aideen says, and it's probably why I describe myself now as a bit of a recovering corporate sustainability practitioner, and I'll tell you a little bit why as I go through. So look, there's no doubt we're at a hugely important time for climate action as a whole, but increasingly now for defining what it is industries and businesses are meant to be doing in this last chance we have to close the gap on the climate action that we need to see. And look, the things we've been calling for as practitioners for more than a decade, they're starting to happen. Like, we're starting to see more of the regulation that will hopefully lower or higher the bar in terms of what is acceptable as corporate climate action. We're starting to seeing a lot more pressure on the reporting side, making it more mandatory, getting away from the mistakes of leaving it to a voluntary effort and bringing it into a mandatory setting. Looking at also the standardisation of reporting disclosure. You don't have to talk to too many practitioners to understand the huge challenges that have existed over the last few years of trying to meet the needs of different disclosure platforms, and all the while distracting from the work that needs to be done. And we're finally starting to see the beginnings of the level of finance and supports that we need going into green innovation and going into those alternatives. And they've obviously come from all those pressures that have been building over the last few decades. The risk now of corporate climate litigation, not only to the companies, but now seeing a test case, for example, with Shell, with the directors, individuals within the company for not readying their company and their industry for the inevitable transition that's coming. We're obviously seeing the physical risks starting to bite much clearer in terms of supply chain disruptions, in terms of raw materials, the price of them, the availability of them. And we're starting to see one of my favourite areas at the moment, I have to say, and one that does give me some hope around investor and employee activism, not standing for the level of corporate climate action that we've seen to date. But I think any time we have a discussion about corporate climate action and what is acceptable and where we set that standard, we have to ground ourselves in the context of the climate crisis and the scale of it. We heard from the President earlier today, and today as we all sit here, people in India and Pakistan are enduring nearly 50 degrees of temperature for sustained time. I can't imagine what that heat feels like. We're talking about having higher levels of carbon in our atmosphere than we've ever had since humans walked this earth. We see deforestation continuing. Our biodiversity continues to decline. Many of our industries in Ireland, their emissions continue to go up, and the 10% of the richest of us around the world, which most of us are part of, whether it feels like it or not, we're responsible for more than 50% of global emissions. And again, as we heard from the President, those least responsible are paying the price and increasingly paying the ultimate price. So we have to be very careful right now about what we accept as enough around corporate climate action and ambition. And I suppose the road to where we are today has gone through many iterations. So corporate climate efforts started with resource efficiency, doing those things that made financial sense as well. Then we got into the CSR, corporate social responsibility, trying to bring in a bit of the social side, but if we're honest, it was really only scratching the surface. And then into the whole triple bottom line, and you've seen it probably 1,000 times, the triple Venn diagram. We're going for that sweet spot in the middle between economy, environment and social. But of course, our jobs, our companies, our industries, they're completely dependent on our climate remaining stable and not vice versa. So we really have to challenge the trade-offs that are falsely put forward around jobs and economic growth versus climate, because we are completely dependent on our climate remaining stable, no matter what industry or what job we have. So now we're into the era of net zero, and we're getting into the regenerative business kind of language. And look, it's the language we've been wanting to hear, the realisation that we don't, as industries, exist in silos. We're part of living systems. We've got to understand what that relationship is like. But we have to be very careful right now that we learn from the past and we don't let that language get co-opted. And while I think it's a big win for the climate movement that we have largely moved away from climate denial, we're now very well into the climate delay stage, which can be equally, if not more, dangerous. And how that shows up in terms of corporate reaction is strategies that are relying on offsets. Offsets that we know aren't doing what we hope they do, offsets that are questionable in terms of the land availability that would be needed to meet the amount of offsets being talked about by industry, not to mention the justice issues there around global north, taking land, etc., from global south just to keep up business as usual. It shows up in techno-optimism, delaying action today because technologies of the future will get us out of this. We don't have time to wait another 10 years for a different kind of technology to kick in so we can continue business as usual today. We have to move now. It shows up in carbon tunnel vision, going big on emissions but ignoring the impacts to our natural world, ignoring the social impacts. It can't be just emissions. We've got to look at things in the whole. It shows up again, like Aideen was saying, and not taking responsibility for your scope 3, just going on the easy stuff, what's happening directly around you, and ignoring your influence up and down your supply chain. And kind of in a strange way, it's showing up now in disclosure. So that disclosure and that mandatory regimes we have so desperately wanted now have a real risk of distracting from the real action. We're conflating disclosure with action, and it's not the same. We've got to do both. We're out of time to wait another 5 years till we have the numbers to then act. You know, if you've got your teams inside and they're being moved now to disclosure and away from direct action, that's a failure. We've got to move away from that and move quicker. So I suppose overall, what we're not doing is we're not designing business models that are in line with what the science says. So for example, like we see the huge growth in resale of fast fashion, resale of second-hand fashion, but fast fashion also continues to grow. We're seeing a huge jump in EVs. They're breaking through all sales forecasts, but our SUVs are continuing to grow as well. Seeing a massive jump in renewable energy, but our fossil fuel consumption continues to grow as well. So we're not displacing, we're trying to have both. And again, planetary limits won't allow that. So for industries, you know, it is hugely challenging. And even for someone like me who's been at this quite a while, you know, the penny is only dropping about the scale of the challenge ahead and what it is we have to do. And we do have to ask if industry is being sent strong enough signals from whether it's media, like we heard from this morning, policy, like we'll hear from later, about this is the direction of travel and there's no more time for watering down ambition. And if you think of it from a carbon budget's point of view, you know, and we need to take our budget and squeeze it down to just about half in 8 years. How does your industry exist with half the budget? Can your industry exist with half the budget? And if your industry is based on consumption and your consumer can consume, what's your industry? And I think these are the kind of questions now we have to start facing up to and making more time and start getting away from solutions that just look at symptoms and start getting to the cause of what is causing the problems. And equally, you know, I think anybody working in sustainability, you're always put under pressure to talk about the positive, to talk about the solutions and the hope. And I think, of course, there's a place for that, but we can't ignore the things that are getting in the way of progress and the things that will continue to get in the way of progress unless we tackle them. So we've got to start talking about power, about misinformation, about lobbying, about what we're going to start, but what we need to stop as well. So for me, in a strange way, I'm holding this tension right now between the frustration and the angst that we have barely begun to do the transition as industries, and potentially holding hope that if we could leverage the smarts, the innovation, the mindsets of people throughout industry who I'm humbled by every single day, their levels of intelligence, if we can point that towards climate action, we can start to unleash real movements here. But for those of us working in the space, and thankfully the growing number of those of us working in the space, we have to be really careful right now, and we have to lean in and not miss this moment. You know, we've been conditioned over time to just be thankful for any little bit of progress because we've had to fight so hard for every little thing. But we are at a really special moment in time where largely things are with us. You know, the public is largely aware of the need for climate action. They're aware of the need, maybe the appetite or the acceptance isn't there yet, but they're aware of the need to move from fossil fuels. And unfortunately, we've never been this close to climate breakdown. So things are on our side, and we should glean courage from that now to demand more within our industries, within our jobs, within our companies, to push for more climate action and not accept the kind of forms of it that have been put forward in the past. So that's going to mean doing things differently. It's going to mean not being bound by commercial realities or hiding behind them. Not always having to have a business case to do something in sustainability. You don't have a business without a stable climate. That is the business case. And to not be so passive on this. You know, industry can't put up its hand and say, oh, we need more regulation, we need more laws. Get out and lobby loudly and advocate loudly for those if that's really what you want to see. And we've got to find better ways to work together, which is something I'm delighted to see the Centre doing, bringing disciplines together. So for me, we're definitely into a new era of corporate climate sustainability. There's no more time for just any progress. There's very little room to hide, and we're starting to understand the systemic shifts that need to be made. But we all each have to challenge what is the role of business going forward. We have to push beyond business as usual and always ground ourselves in the context of the crisis. And we have to find courage in the limited time that we have left, in the fact that things are largely with us to demand more, and not miss this moment and not make the mistakes of old. Thank you very much.
That was great, Ali. Laura Wadding is my name, and I'm a partner with Deloitte. And I have more questions in my head now than I have answers, to be honest. like, how did I end up on the same podium as the president, less than 2 hours after he gave a magnificent, impassioned speech about climate and the environment? I'm here to talk about hope and provide solutions, Ali. That's my job. And I am reminiscent of Michael D. Higgins mentioning the half a century that he has spent talking about this topic. And as a regulatory compliance professional, I can with certainty say I've spent a quarter of a century talking about the topic of regulatory compliance. So I have a long way to go, I think, if I'm going to stand up. And I'm also reminiscent of Orlagh from the Journal this morning saying that it took her some time to get her head around Article 6. And Article 6 is a microcosm of what I'm about to talk about. So bear with me for a moment. And I appreciate we've lots of different specialist areas in the room. But you'll see where I'm going in a sec. So I'm going to just mention some letters, not words and then more words, but some letters. IFRS, ISSB, SFDR, NFRD, CSRD, UNPRI, UNPRB, the EU taxonomy, the EU social taxonomy, the EU Green Deal, the EU Green Bond framework. And that is the tip of the iceberg, people. Thank you. If anyone wants to ask me what any of those things mean, just save it for when I'm not on a mic, if you don't mind. They're the letters that go around in my head and in the heads of the Deloitte team on sustainability at the moment, many of whom are dotted in the audience here. And the reason that they go around in our head is because they are the rules, the expectations, the disclosure requirements that our corporate clients are expected to be able to comply with. Some are voluntary, but most of them are mandatory. They are all evolving. They are evolving in the UK, in the EU, in the US. They are evolving at different paces. There are different levels of maturity between those jurisdictions, and yet some of the corporates that are based here in Ireland they operate in all of those jurisdictions. So we have some of the biggest corporates in the world headquartered here, who serve not just the Irish community, but they trade in the UK, across the EU, in the US, in Asia, in Australia. We have global, and I know we talk about the reversal of globalisation, but we have some of the biggest corporates in the world operating out of Ireland. And they have to comply with not just one, but all of those reporting requirements globally. That is no mean feat. That requires calibration of data at a minimum. It requires some thinking around strategy and philosophy and purpose. It involves commitment. It involves the deployment of resources. It involves the acquisition of talent in the market as well, and the deployment of that talent. So, having the right people to make the right assessments about what a firm is deciding to do in the area of sustainability, and how it's going to manage its risk. And we'll come back to that point about what is climate risk anyway in a minute, because for corporates it's actually starting to mean lots of different things. And so we have a big role to play in Ireland because of the size of some of the entities that are headquartered here. And so I think that makes Ireland it gives Ireland the potential to be leaders in the corporate landscape on sustainability, and an opportunity for those firms in all sectors, by the way. So we're not just talking about the international financial sector or consumer or tech. We've got leading firms in all sectors who are based here. So I think that puts Ireland in a really unique position, and also will probably see us punching ultimately above our weight in the global fight against climate change. You might wonder, what does that mean for Deloitte? What would Deloitte know about climate change? So we work with many of those clients, and we help them to figure out how they're going to respond to that challenge of increased demand for disclosures, not just through regulation, but also through investor lobbying groups, because that's driving a lot of what corporates are expected to disclose at the moment. And we help them to figure out how they can apply some pragmatism, but also take a strategic approach to what they're going to disclose, and probably more importantly, when. Because the regulation is going to take some time to embed. And as I said, it's still evolving. And so corporates have a choice to make now as to whether to make certain information available to the public or wait until they're obliged to do so by regulation. And that's a challenge that many of our clients face. But we're a corporate too. So we have the same challenge, and we have to make sure that, you know, we're clear to be, you know, practicing what we preach. And as Deloitte, we certainly don't want to be seen to be saying and doing something in the market and advising our clients in a certain way without taking our own medicine, so to speak. So I think there's an important role for, you know, what is now the biggest professional services firm in the world, and the influence that we could have with those large clients who are operating here and globally, and the way that we can help them to, you know, dial up the pace of change and to really get on top of some of the issues that they're facing, not just in terms of regulatory reporting requirements, but also the strategy and direction of travel as well. On the topic of what is climate risk anyway, Ali, you mentioned well, I don't know, one of you mentioned the 1.5 degree and trying to keep, so look, we're probably losing that battle, I would say, globally. You know, I think that, so when we talk about climate risk, we talk about it in two ways. We talk about transition risk and we talk about physical risk. So the transition risk and the cost of transition risk is what companies need to pay to transition. So what does that mean in terms of a change in their operating model, their supply chain that Ali mentioned, and, you know, their global carbon footprint, and what they need to change and how they're going to manage that change and what it's going to cost them to transition. If we don't all transition, then we have physical risk, because the temperature keeps going up and we have all the things associated with that, you know, the physical risks, the rising flood waters, the temperature being uninhabitable, some of the devastating human impact that the President referred to this morning. So the likelihood is, as we move forward, that we're going to have a bit of both. And for corporates and for all of us, I think the real challenge is in trying to figure out how we can, you know, improve the narrative and improve the pace of action, so that on balance we've got more transition risk than we have physical risk. I think that's the goal at this stage. And to coin Dave Robbins from this morning, we are all needed and we are all welcome. And that's certainly the approach that we're taking. Thank you.
Hi. So my name is Sarah Dempsey and I work in AIB. And firstly, we are obviously delighted to be asked to be part of this conversation. Over the next couple of minutes, I want to try and give you just, I suppose, some very practical ways in which we have started to address this issue in our business. And I'm going to cover kind of three areas. The first is around stakeholder engagement. The second is the path that we have actually been on for the last number of years. And then finally, to talk about the future and what comes next. I think probably I won't start from any version of hope. I think it's been really, really, really challenging. And if I start back 5 years ago, or nearly 5 years ago, when I joined AIB, this AIB was 100% owned, or 99% owned by the government at the time. The government was looking to sell down its shareholding, and it was faced with this issue by one of its stakeholders, the investor community, to say, what are you doing about climate change and what are you doing about this area of sustainability? And we had to think pretty quickly about actually what that meant for our business. And sustainability experts or sustainability professionals are at that time, were a pretty singular number. And it's a pretty lonely road. And you need to be really resilient, and you need to have a Kevlar jacket to actually go into some of the stakeholder meetings, to actually start talking to people about fundamental change in business strategy and fundamental change about how businesses work, how they engage with their stakeholder,
and stakeholder expectations. We put our stakeholders into two different groups. The first group are those who actually influence our business, and they be investors, regulators, government policy. And they're, if you like, a smaller number, but they have a really strong impact. And then on the other side of the house, we have stakeholders who are impacted by everything that we do. And they are our customers, 2.8 million and plus across the island of Ireland and beyond, and our employees, over 9,000 across the island of Ireland. And as the biggest bank in the country, we have an enormous responsibility to address this challenge, an enormous responsibility to actually take it by the scruff of the neck and bring it internally into what we do and how we do it day in, day out. And that is an unbelievable challenge. I can't imagine for a global business how that is, but for a local business, just to give you some perspective, it really does mean fundamentally changing the way you do business from the inside out in order to effect real change. We started this journey, as I say, about just nearly 5 years ago. And at that point, and this isn't to slap myself on the back, it was literally a party of one, with the very strong support of our board and of our executive team behind the work that we were being asked to do. And we set up really good governance structures to try and get this on the agenda and on the strategic agenda for the business. All the time, we brought into having those arguments and having those debates around the table stakeholder insights and stakeholder demand, be that investors, be that regulators, be that government, or indeed the changing way consumers and customers wanted us to behave, or employees and what they were expecting of us as a business. And for the first 2 years, it was pretty difficult, and it was very lonely. We also published, and we're the first bank to publish, Ireland's standalone sustainability report on the progress that we were making, or not, as the case may be, and the gaps that we had, and the challenges that we had. We held ourselves, and continue to hold ourselves, to very high standards. We report against GRI, another alphabet acronym, but we report to GRI standards, the Global Reporting Index. We get our report independently assured by Deloitte. They've independently assured every report that we have published since 2016. That's really important for us because actually, and not to blow a trumpet here, but actually back to the point around disclosures, accountability, transparency, that team every single year, we fight with them tooth and nail around telling the good story, but also telling the not so good story, where we are failing, where we have gaps, where we have more to do. And that's a very difficult conversation, even internally, because you bring those comments back internally, and you say, in order to be true leaders, we have to talk about where we've done really well, but equally where we failed and where we haven't lived up to what we said we were going to do. And that's very, very difficult at times. First 2 years, very challenging. 3 years ago, with the advent of a new CEO to the business, because this takes real leadership, Colin Hunt is our current CEO, and he made it really clear to myself and to the then team that was growing, was that we wanted to be Ireland's Green Bank. Full stop. That's what we wanted to be. He fundamentally believes, he has 3 young daughters, he talks about them an awful lot, but he talks about the onus and the responsibility that he holds in business, but as a parent, to the next generation. And we really did then set out and embark on a programme of activity where externally we talk about our pledge to do more, because one product, one customer segment, one employee proposition is not enough. We need to do more. But equally, we did start setting targets for ourselves. Sustainability is a key part of our corporate strategy, and we put out 2 ambitions. First, that we would be net zero in our own operations by 2030, and secondly, that 70% of our lending would be greener transition by 2030. Now, 2030, it's a long way away, but actually it's not. It is very close. For a bank, and I quote Christiana Figueres, who spoke at one of our sustainability conferences, but she had this great line which said, "Where the carbon goes, the money follows. Where the money goes, the carbon follows." Only about 5% of our emissions come from our own operations. We're making really unbelievable progress in reducing our own operational carbon footprint. And we will be net zero by 2030. We are hoping that as a very last resort, we use offsets. Very last resort. We will be doing everything we can to eliminate carbon from our own operations. And 19% in the last year alone. I think it's 65% since we started measuring. So we're doing an unbelievable amount in that regard. The bigger issue we have, and it's not to put it onto somebody else, is the money we put out the door. The carbon goes, the money follows. We need to support and we need to finance, and this is where banks are central to the transition. We need to finance low carbon activity. When the government talks about the level of investment that's required to move Ireland, we are central to that investment. We are central to working with stakeholders, with government, with investors, with policymakers, with corporates, with customers, day in, day out, in helping them to move. Over 95% of our carbon emissions come from the money that goes out the door. So it behoves us to work with our customers to move them along. The biggest challenge we have, corporates, they kind of have to do it. Regulation, investor sentiment, it's moving them to do it. Consumers want to do it, but they don't really know how, and they want companies like us to make it easier for them to do. That's why you do things like green mortgages, green personal loans, to try and incentivize them to go green as opposed to actually stay with the norm. We are challenged in the middle. Ireland is a country that not only relies on FDI, but equally relies on an enormous SME sector. And that sector, be it agriculture, be it transport, be it manufacturing, food agri, have very, very real challenges right now. COVID, Brexit, rising inflation. And the last thing on many of their minds is actually climate action, which they see as 2030, 2040, 2050. It'll happen. So we need to bring it to the here and now. So when I look forward in terms of then what comes next, it is about greater disclosure. It is about trying to align everything we do with the alphabet soup of ESG and all the regulation that's coming down the tracks, not just in Ireland, in Europe, globally. We need to constantly try and benchmark ourselves against what does good look like, where are our gaps, and where do we need to fill it in. But equally, what you'll hear more from AIB in the next number of months and years is really turning, if you'll forgive me, the heat up on the timeline, because we're simply not moving fast enough. If I look at over the last number of years on our level of reporting, we started off with green lending, which we never measured up until 3 years ago. We then went to about 10% per annum. Last year, it was 19% on average of our overall loan book was in green lending. Our first quarter results, which were out this morning, were up to 22%, but it's just not fast enough. And we talk about, and it is talked about in the industry, of this is the decade of change. We don't actually have a decade. We have about a year or two, maybe 3, to fundamentally change business models, to win hearts and minds of customers, to get them on the journey. And our job as a bank is to work with other stakeholders, those who influence our business and those who are impacted by our business, to make that change and to move the agenda on, to do more, but to do it faster. And that's where our focus lies for the future. Thanks.
Great. So thank you very much to everyone on our panel. And I'm going to follow the format of this morning, actually. Thank you. I'm going to follow the format of this morning and maybe go to the audience first, if that's okay, just to make sure that we get time to ask some audience questions. So if we have some microphones, that would be great. I see a few hands up. So there's someone in the middle here, some towards the back.
Hi there, my name is Anna Pringle. Thank you all for your presentations. I'm very struck by, and I can't remember, sorry if it was Aideen or Aideen that said it, that we're conflating reporting with action. And then Laura talked a lot about compliance and what is becoming a compliance industry. And I'm sure you've got a great consulting practice built on that, which is great. And then I'm curious about, Sarah said that you need to fundamentally change how we do business, but I didn't really hear much about the fundamentals of your business other than green mortgages, which I think is a good product. But if you look at banking, for example, are you supporting oil and gas industry? I know Deloitte lists the oil and gas industry as one of its key client sectors, for example. If we are fundamentally, as in a bank, you want to drive consumption, how is that compatible with being a bank? And how is it compatible with what you're investing in and all that? So I'd love to hear a bit more about how your fundamental business is going to change.
Sure. Do you want to take that? Yeah. So, a couple of things. The first is on the fundamentals of our business. So, our business is essentially around risk management and the risk of lending money out the door. So, over the last, in particular, 18 months, we have identified climate risk, both physical and transition, in our loan book, and we have done what we call a heat mapping exercise across our business to see what are the sectors that we are most exposed on, and where does that leave us in terms of our overall loan book. We're not just looking at it, our regulators are looking at it as well, and how exposed is our loan book to climate risk. What that then means is that within all of our risk management processes, operational risk, how we run our business, where our physical buildings are, the money we lend out the door in terms of who we lend to, and starting to screen everything that goes out the door with climate risk. So if you walk into an AIB branch today, or you get on the phone to your relationship manager, you will be asked a series of questions. You'll have to go through an ESG questionnaire and a sustainable lending framework so we can start classifying your lending and what that means for our business in terms of the level of risk we're taking on in terms of your exposure to climate. So that's the kind of the first thing on that. The second thing is we do actually have an exclusions list. Actually, our CEO referenced it last week in a conference that he talked about where Dervin McDonald was moderating, and it became the blacklist. But there are sectors that we don't lend to, and that is across our business. And they do include things like oil, gas, exploration, nuclear, the sex industry, pet farming. It is up there on our thing, and we won't lend to those businesses. And we are turning away business for businesses that come to us looking for, and in particular, businesses that aren't willing to transition. So there are some businesses who have been built for generations on doing certain activities. They need to transition. So we will actively work with every customer to work on what their transition plan is. But we have very little appetite for customers who aren't willing to actually make the transition. The final point I'll say is that we are in the market also in terms of our actual capital and our treasury teams around. We have published two green bonds to the market where we've attracted over nearly 3 billion of capital, or 2 billion of capital in green bond lending over the last year and a half, trying to create a virtuous circle of green lending. So those things kind of, I'm able to say about them or talk to them 2 or 3 minutes. They take months of work and months of internal structural change about actually how we do our business. We didn't do those things 2 or 3 years ago. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Thank you.
I'm Anthony Strait from DCU. I have an observation first and then a question. The observation is that in the last week, the shareholders of Goldman Sachs and I think Citigroup rejected by thumping majorities proposals to shift back away from investment in oil and gas. The observation is this: as I speak to you at the moment, of the big 4 consulting companies, 3 of them are being sued for over $1 billion each in a series of litigations for grotesque frauds of various kinds. Whether they're responsible or not remains to be seen. Is there a likelihood that companies will be sued for allowing accounts to go through that misstate the values of the assets of the fuel companies? If I look at Shell, for example, approximately 70% of their market value is their unexploited asset base. Now, I would say that unexploited asset base is worth about 2p. The market says it's worth about 40 billion, and the accountants are signing off on the latter figure rather than the former figure. Are they at risk of being sued?
Can I say one thing before I respond to that?
We never fight with our clients. I needed the mic to say that, but we do have healthy debate from time to time, which is actually part of the response to this question as well. You know, like there's a role for an auditor. There's always been a role for an auditor. There is conduct risk in every sector of society, and so there's always a risk that, regardless of the role that you could get it wrong from time to time, either advertently or inadvertently. On this topic, we are firmly committed to making sure that we are having the discussion with our client, that we are having the debate, that we are having the fight, which is very challenging to do when you are a professional services firm and your role is to serve your client. We are fighting. We are here for the fight. Put it that way. There is a risk. There's a risk of litigation in all of this. It is probably, you know, and I have spent a long time in the area of regulation, in particular with the financial sector, and you know that the risk of litigation is rising on the basis that it's more culturally acceptable now to take a case against somebody if they don't do what you have expected them to do, or if they've lied to you potentially. So I think it's more common in the area of the sort of the reputational aspect of everything to do with climate change, all of the disclosures, the transparency, the integrity of financial statements, the level of assurance that's applied to that. Generally, it is full of reputational risk, absolutely, and absolutely incumbent on the corporates that we're talking about and their auditors to get this right and to present a transparent, honest, complete picture when making those disclosures, not part of the picture or not an incorrect picture. It's about the transparency. So there is a journey to go on that, you know, and we certainly see our role as being part of that journey, as being a leading part of that.
Thanks, Laura. I think there's a question in the back as well. We'll take another one. Yeah.
How are you? Conor Barry. Two questions related. You talked about turning up the heat, getting things to move faster. What boring things can be done? Is it poultry reporting or SMEs? And that matter of company law? Sorry, the microphone. Are there changes in company law that should be made? I'll speak up. Don't break your microphone. Are there changes in company law that should be made for SMEs, given that the larger companies have these familiarity with reporting? Or what really worries us and nitty-gritty things should policymakers be considering in order to turn that heat up within the business community? Or what role should corporates and large corporates like AIB be undertaking to turn that heat up? The related question is around contagion. Your climate leader, how do you ensure that other corporates are learning from what you've done right and getting that contagion of a good message through to other corporates to get them to follow the right path?
So I think to your first question, I think it's all of the above. I think it requires supplier demands, that suppliers make more demands on the companies that they're supplying into. I think it's the customers, and customers are starting to change behaviours. I think employees are also starting to choose who they work for and who they don't work for, and climate is becoming an issue. We do know that in attracting our graduate recruitment programme, the number one reason that graduates are coming to AIB actually is because of our position on sustainability and climate action, because we have it so central to everything that we do. I think also there is investors, probably not so much for the SMEs, but I think certainly in terms of, if you look at the government's climate action plan, if you look at other legislation, I think the more that can be introduced, taking into account
that for an SME in particular in Ireland, our Irish SMEs are smaller than the European SMEs, are a larger number in terms of, I think the average is about 45 or 50 people. In Ireland, they are mom and pop shops, 4 or 5 people sitting around a kitchen table. So, they're dealing with all kinds of issues. So it does need to factor that in, but I think that nothing should be off the table and everything should be ruled in. Our job is to then say, how can we build products and services to support that transition? So for instance, on corporates, we do things like sustainability linked loans, where the lending starts at a certain rate, and if a corporate or a large business meets certain targets and certain criteria, the rate falls and the lending becomes cheaper. In the same vein, if you come in looking for a mortgage, if you're actually buying a new build or you're doing a retrofit, your rate will be cheaper than if you were to try and buy a C or D bare rate at home. So I think we're at such a point, an inflection point, that nothing should be off the table. But going back to my own point around stakeholder management, being abundantly open and transparent so you can all learn from one another. Like, we've made mistakes, people make mistakes all the time, and an acceptance of that. We don't always get it right. But I think that's really important. So engagement with stakeholders and put nothing off the table.
I was going to say that, because I think we really do need to have a look at our SME sector here, because they are hugely important. And if you look at some of the disclosure regimes that we were talking about earlier, like CSRD, the mandatory corporate sustainability reporting, it's already been delayed in terms of its initial time frame, again, down to lobbying, and then there's an extra few years built in there to let SMEs catch up. And understandably, the argument is the red tape, it takes time and resources. There's already 1 in 5 SME suppliers getting dropped based on sustainability criteria or lack of. Because you can imagine, as an end company, and your scope 3 is based on your supplier's performance, you're going to pick, if the alternatives are there, you're going to pick the suppliers who have the data, and who have the better data. And I have a real concern about how we're incentivising and how we're supporting or not our Irish SMEs on this, and how the funds are coming through. Online tools are not enough because they are such micro enterprises. It's boots on the ground, hand-holding, really supporting industry here if they are to continue to sustain and grow. And it's something I think that just seems to have flown under the cover in terms of CSRD, and I think something we really need to keep an eye on.
Yeah, I might just say a couple of quick things on legislation and on oil and gas, two of my favourite things. So absolutely agree with the resourcing on SMEs, by the way. On the legislation, so there's lots coming through at European level and at international level as well. There was a bill last year that Lynn Ruane put forward in Ireland for companies to disclose on climate. And I think part of that bill, I don't know if it made it into the final draft, but part of it was going to be, that there would be penalties or sanctions if targets weren't achieved. Now, I didn't see corporations, maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, I didn't see corporations in Ireland lobbying for this bill that would encourage more corporate reporting on climate. So, that's something that we could do very concretely. There's a bill there that could be passed. And the second thing, oil and gas, I'm so glad this has been brought up, because BP announced its quarter one results the other day. Their profits were $6.2 billion. It's their highest quarterly profits in 10 years. And it's all to do with the war. People say no profits on a dead planet, but someone will monetize it, and it'll probably be BP or Elon Musk. But yeah, what is going on that an oil and gas company is recording its highest profit levels in 10 years? And what is the role of its advisors? We have professional services firms here, the financial sector here. At what point, I know they're difficult conversations to have with clients, but at what point, and this comes back to who's responsible for what emissions? Where's the responsibility for, BP's sustainability advisors, BP's tax consultants? It's a huge issue in Ireland. And at what point do you draw the line and say, this is not working? An economic system where a corporation is allowed to make these kinds of profits while actively destroying the planet. Where do we draw the line? And I think these are things that we have to start saying out loud. And it's something that every business needs to be thinking about.
So I might add a couple of comments there as well. 3 words jumped to mind. Just when you were asking the question, I'm going to take this as well, so I'm really double mic'd up, so you can all hear me. The just transition is not a term that I would use, by accident or inadvertently. This has to be fair. and there's only so much that we can expect from individuals and from SMEs in shifting the dial. You know, like the big players have much more responsibility, including, as the President pointed out, the state, right? So we've got, you know, big institutional players here and internationally who have the lion's share of responsibility. And so we need to make sure that we talk about this in a fair way, so that everybody can do their bit and can do it within the means that are available to them. Second to that, I would say collaboration is absolutely key. So, you know, I know people look at Deloitte and they see this big global firm, and we're an auditor, and, you know, we're capitalists and all the rest. Most of what we're doing at the moment is investing our time collaborating with organisations around the country to support just the development of thought leadership and to enhance the conversation in the boardroom. So we're actually going to launch a company next week in collaboration with the Institute of Directors and HSBC and Chartered Accountants Ireland and IBEC. And that company is a not-for-profit organisation which is designed to increase the level of awareness and knowledge in the boardroom for non-executive directors in all sectors of society. And we're all investing our time to do that, right? So we're volunteering our time on top of our day jobs, because we believe that that's really important, and that director community, the non-executives whose role is to protect the customers of the organisations on the board, you know, on whose boards they sit, they've got a real voice, and the more that we can help them to understand the topic, the better those conversations can be had. And I did have a third word that came to mind, but I think I've forgotten it now, so I might leave it there.
Not to worry. I think that worked maybe better than. I hope you can hear me okay. So yeah, we're going to actually have to leave it there, because we're going to have to make sure we have time for a break before our next session. But I mean, we could have continued on the conversation. We started to talk about, you know, non-profits there. I'm glad SMEs were brought up. There was agreement on that. And, you know, we could have talked more about the different types of stakeholder engagement and how to foster a culture of leadership within corporates, not just within the sustainability teams, not just at leadership level, but, you know, for everyone, and kind of mechanisms to do that. So anyway, that we could have gone on and on, but I just want to say a massive thank you to the panel. It was really great to have, you know, an all-female panel as well, and thank you for our audience and for our questions. So I think it's 3:10 that we're back. Okay, so thank you all very much.